writing for over 30 years now. Would you tell us about your writing history?
I had never really thought about becoming a writer. I went to an unusual college in the States, Reed College. There were no textbooks. You only read original sources. And we met in seminar groups of 12 to 15 students with a professor and would spend the classes talking, arguing, discussing whatever we were reading at the time. And the senior year, you spent your whole senior year doing a thesis.
So writing.
Writing. But,
and reading.
but learning really how to think critically. Okay. I can't say that I enjoyed writing my thesis. But
even though your first writing experience was critical thinking, which...
Well, that's no accident. So that's why. So I had the unusual experience of being taught how to think critically. And then when I became trained as a psychotherapist, there was no critical thinking. You were taught a theory and a methodology, and it was the best thing since sliced bread. And I was, training in more than one thing at the same time. So it was a little bit hard to believe that. Then when I started doing more formal training, both with my trainees in Pittsburgh and workshops and TA conferences, I started doing workshops that were more about thinking about theory rather than teaching theory. So it really had much more to do with my teaching. And then Rebecca Troutman, who was the editor of the TAJ back in the 1980s, asked me to write an article. And I said, I don't write. Yeah, my first writing was TA. I wrote a couple of brief articles in the TA journal. One was sort of political, teaching people what matters. Another one was my first effort to bring some of my body training and TA training together, but they were very brief. I don't think they were very satisfying. But anyway, but I certainly wasn't thinking of myself as a writer. And Rebecca asked me she was in a workshop I did on script theory. She asked me to write an article, which basically came out of a workshop. She said, just write up the workshop.
And that has become such an important article, at least in our school, we really teach it. It's so important. So how was that first experience for you?
It was horrible.
Oh, very encouraging.
Probably for the first 10 years of writing, it was just agony.
And what was the difficult part of it?
I had a very demanding parent ego state. I was very concerned that what I was writing was accurate. I was representing other people's ideas clearly and accurately. And I was writing more from an academic perspective, even though I wasn't writing for academic journals, but I was writing more with an academic parent in my head rather than as a clinician and as a psychotherapist. So it wasn't a lot of fun. And yet it felt important. And I could see in the way some of the articles were taken up, that having that kind of critical thinking was valuable to people. And then my friend Suzanne Robinson up in Canada offered me her cabin on a lake for 1 month every August.
Your retreat, so well described
in the Beach Lake Papers. And that's when I really began to form an identity as a writer. And began to really find pleasure in it. And I would write rough drafts by hand at that point, and Suzanne and I would sit on the roof of her boathouse with a good bottle of wine and argue about the whatever I'd written that day, and but then things really came to life.
After being a writer, you became an editor, and you were first editor for the script. I think that was your first editing job. How was that, moving on to editor?
That was somewhat unexpected. George Kohlreiser, who was the president of the ITA at the time, asked me if I would edit the script, and I thought, yeah, okay. But then again, I had a similar agenda, because I wanted the script to become a forum where people could write from different points of view, and it wasn't just a little, rah-rah monthly newspaper anymore. I wanted it to have some substance. So, I really took it on with the same kind of project in mind of that there were ideas and a cross current of ideas and disagreements, and that it was an in-house publication that really encouraged dialogue and interchange.
Yeah, and then you moved on to being a THA editor.
Yeah, and that's a whole different process.
Very different, I think.
Being the editor of the script is a little bit like being a publicist, trying to get people to come forward and share their ideas and news and that kind of thing. And again, I became an editor of the TAJ kind of by accident, because I'd been a reviewer for quite a while. And again, with that read college critical thinking, my reviews were, I think, often quite different than a lot of the other reviews. I had been on the ITA Board of Trustees in various positions for quite a while, and I stunk at it. I was just terrible. It wasn't my spot, and I wanted to contribite. I wanted to contribute to TA, and I thought this is where I actually have a skill to offer.
In writing.
In writing and editing, and and in the literature. I was asked to do that. I didn't want to do it alone. From the beginning, I thought
you were never the sole editor.
No, we had to have a team. Partly because it's just too much work. It's an enormous amount of work. But also by then, I'd profited so much from being edited. Robin, who's been the editor of the TAJ for a long time now,
a masterful editor.
She is truly a master. And I've been edited by lots of different people at this point, but rarely anybody with the skill and the thoughtfulness of Robin. So, it was more through editing that I learned, how do you structure an article? How...
Through being an editor yourself.
First by being edited.
So interesting. So, yeah, first being edited. And
it made me a much better writer. Made me a more effective writer. So then, my experience in being edited informed my becoming an editor.
And so you've been editor of the TAJ for how long now?
15 years.
15 years. Wow. And you are moving on.
And I'm moving on.
How does that feel?
Weird.
You haven't dropped it yet. In a little while.
2 more months.
2 more months. Yeah, you have a lot of free time and
well, I'm
and you'll be, I guess, missing some things, or
I'll miss. I'll miss the camaraderie of the co-editors. We're a great team. I'm also at a point where it really felt right for me to step out so that other people, newer voices, younger voices, could step in. It was the right time.
You talk about that sometimes, the aging therapist, and you're not, I wouldn't call you an aging editor, but it's
I'm not getting any younger.
Well, I guess, yes, you're not getting younger, you're probably aging, unless you stopped time somehow. So you are now becoming the editor of a book series at Routledge.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell us about that? What's that series going to be like?
Okay. Let me tell you one other thing first that I think, which also has to do with being edited. And this is more in the context of books than journal articles, because I've also been, edited for the books I've done. One, which is sort of the classic example, was the book I wrote for Pio, which I never would have written if I hadn't been approached by the editor, Gail.
Yes.
And she talked me into it in a certain way. And she, that's probably the writing that is in my most personal voice.
So Gail Fontaine,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. And without Gail, that book wouldn't have happened. And that book represented a real transition.
That's wonderful. And she really was invested in it as well. Both of you really worked hard on that one.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And I've had that experience. The book that I wrote on somatic experience, Lou Aaron was my editor. And he was very involved in the editing of the book, the fashioning of the book, the sequence of the chapters, and again, pushing me. It's part of what I struggle with as a writer is leaving more of the academic voice that I had learned and writing in both a more clinical voice but a more personal voice.
Yes, I was thinking about that balance between academic, which you don't want to lose all of that.
Right.
It is valuable.
Yeah.
So would you tell us about that series?
Yeah, so the book series, again, these things just kind of show up. But, we were in the process of changing publishers for the TAJ to Routledge. And as I was doing those negotiations, the senior editor there said, it might be interesting if we did a book series. Write up a proposal. It'll be a, ITAA kind of imprint.
It is a TA book series.
It is a TA, specifically TA book series. So I wrote up a proposal called Innovations in Transactional Analysis. And they accepted it.
Innovations in transactional analysis. So
Yeah.
they're innovating people.
Well, really new, like right now we've got, at least a half a dozen book proposals in the works. People, first-time authors.
Wow.
2 books have already been accepted for publication.
Are these what, American authors, European authors?
No, European authors. One Italian psychiatrist who's written an amazing book on Malacqua. And a book on the treatment of schizophrenics and psychosis. And a second book which has just been approved on the sort of the political and social context of psychotherapy by James Sedgwick, who's a TA therapist and a university professor in England. So
Yeah, it sounds very promising.
It's really exciting.
So it'll be the first time you edit books.
Yeah, from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's
Looking forward to it.
yeah, and it's a very different experience because it's a different kind of engagement with the author.
Yeah.
You know, to really help them go from kind of a bright idea to a coherent idea, and to really be able to articulate and flesh out, you know, a coherent set of ideas. So it's.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about writing, editing, being edited? Perhaps the difference between writing and editing?
Well, I think between writing and editing. I mean, now when I write, I kind of have an editor in my head. You know, I mean, I edit a lot of my own
Self-edit.
writing. You know, I can look at an article. I can look at my article objectively. Does the structure work? You know, I have had countless hundreds, if not thousands, of run-on sentences edited into short sentences. Now I can usually spot them on my own, things like that. But I think the other thing, because I write, you know, I like you said earlier, you know, I mean, TA is my home base, but I also write, you know, in the body psychotherapy field and in psychoanalysis. And I think one of the things that's changed over the period of time that I've been writing is that these different disciplines are becoming more open to other ideas and more capacity to be self-critical. You know, so you get less and less out of the "we've got the way," and you know, there's a significant
the best bread thing.
the best bread, yeah. You know, and so that's exciting because that's the interchange that I really like.
Would you like to say a few words about this particular book? What book is like?
That's a series mostly of articles, mostly of probably about the last 10 years, where I've used psychoanalysis to critique transactional analysis. I've used somatic perspectives to critique psychoanalysis. I've used TA to critique and expand psychoanalysis.
Like the good old critical
and
thinking.
all these, exactly, yeah, you know, and also it represents, you know, some of my investment in the political and social aspects of psychotherapy.
So a good summary
Yeah,
of your writing.
yeah,
Even though you do already have 2 books out with the Meech Lake Papers and Somatic Experience, which are also collections of articles, but this one is really recent articles.
yeah. These are recent articles, and you know, and somatic experience was kind of, some of that were revisions of journal articles, but most of it was new writing.
Okay, yes. This one is the English version of the book you did with Gaël Fontaine at Payot.
And you're welcome to say it in French, the title.
Yes,
the
Une
original
vie
title.
pour être soi.
Saved me
And
from
then-
embarrassing myself.
The title in English is very different
Very,
from Une
very
vie pour être
different.
soi.
My original title for that book was When It Is As Though Life and Death Are Holding Hands. I loved that title.
Yes.
Payot said no. Routledge said no. Recently, a psychoanalyst who I'd never met before was thumbing through the table of contents, and I named one of the chapters that, and he read it and he said, "That should have been the title of the book." I was like, yes!
Death instinct, life instinct. I found that. I've read a few of the chapters,
Yeah.
and I mentioned some of them in my training group the other day, and they said, "He didn't say that in Une vie."
Yeah, because Routledge wanted to orient it more toward a professional audience. And they were extremely supportive of this book. It really, frankly, surprised me because it's so unusual. But what they found valuable about it is that it's such an illustration of the therapist's process of self-examination. And they say, there's lots of stuff about self-disclosure, blah-de-blah, but the discipline of self-examination is very different. So they wanted that front and center.
Yes, and students have been finding it very useful, even the French version, which is less academic, but it's nevertheless really, really useful for people who are thinking of being therapists. What is it like? And since you take the point of view of the therapist as well as you as a patient, client, it really opens up many fields for people. They can experience it in a sense.
Yeah, it's, because I write about, obviously, my experience of myself as a psychotherapist, also as a supervisee, and as a patient.